What if the homeless man you ignored on the street was actually a forgotten war hero? When Shaquille O'Neal saw an elderly veteran shivering on the sidewalk, he had no idea that this man had once saved countless lives on the battlefield. But when Shaq looked closer at his old rusted dog tag, he froze. This wasn't just any veteran. This was a legend. And what happened next? No one saw it coming. Hey, real quick, before we get into this wild story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? The city hummed with life. Car horns blared, neon signs flickered, and hurried footsteps echoed against the wet pavement. Crowds rushed past, bundled in thick coats, lost in their own worlds. But in the middle of the chaos, an old man sat slumped against a building wall, gripping a battered cardboard sign with trembling hands. Veteran, hungry, anything helps. His frail fingers curled against the fabric of his thin coat, pulling it tighter around his bony frame as the night air bit at his skin. He shivered but didn't complain. He had learned long ago that the world had stopped listening. A few pedestrians glanced at him, their gazes flickering with brief pity before they looked away, as if acknowledging him would make them responsible. Others walked by without even noticing. He adjusted his position on the cold sidewalk, wincing as his joints protested. The hunger gnawed at his stomach, a familiar ache that never seemed to go away. Then laughter. A group of young men strolled down the sidewalk, their expensive sneakers tapping against the pavement. One of them nudged his friend and nodded toward the old man. "Man, look at this guy," one snickered. "Bet he makes more money sitting there than we do working." His friend laughed. "Dude, don't fall for it. Half these guys aren't even real vets." The old man kept his head down, his grip tightening on his sign. He had heard it all before. The mockery, the skepticism, the assumption that he was some kind of scam artist. A sneakered foot kicked the cup beside him, sending a few scattered coins clinking against the pavement. The young man walked away without a second thought, still laughing. He sighed, his breath visible in the cold air. Then the sidewalk darkened. A massive shadow stretched across the pavement, blocking the neon glow of the storefront behind him. The old man blinked, confused. It wasn't the shadow of a single person. It was broader, taller, like a moving wall. Slowly he lifted his head. Towering over him was a giant. Not just any giant, one he recognized instantly. The massive frame, the deep brown eyes, the unmistakable presence. Shaquille O'Neal. The old man froze, stunned. Shaq crouched down, meeting his gaze. His voice was low but filled with concern. "How long have you been out here, sir?" The old man swallowed, his throat dry. For the first time in years, someone wasn't looking past him. Someone was looking right at him. The old man barely gets a word out before Shaq notices something. A small metal tag hanging around the veteran's neck. His eyes narrow in recognition. The cold wind cut through the streets, but Shaq barely felt it. He crouched down in front of the frail old man, concern creasing his brow. The veteran barely lifted his head, as if expecting just another stranger to glance at him with pity before moving on. Shaq's deep voice softened. "How long have you been out here, sir?" The man shifted slightly, his stiff fingers tightening around the thin fabric of his worn-out coat. His hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Years of struggle, of being unseen. "Long enough," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Shaq studied him carefully. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, his eyes sunken, but still holding a quiet dignity. His body, once strong, had withered under the weight of hardship. As the old man moved, something caught Shaq's eye. Hanging from a thin chain around his neck was a dull, scratched-up dog tag. Shaq frowned. The metal clinked slightly as the veteran adjusted his coat, but Shaq had already caught a glimpse of the name engraved on it. A name that stirred something familiar deep in his memory. Dawson. F. Shaq's eyes narrowed. His mind raced. The old man noticed Shaq staring and instinctively clutched the dog tag, his fingers closing around it as if protecting a piece of himself. "It's just an old thing," the veteran muttered, glancing away. Shaq wasn't convinced. His gaze lingered on the tag, his mind flipping through the years like pages in a book. He had heard that name before. Then it hit him. Shaq straightened slightly. "Where did you serve?" The veteran's head snapped up, his tired eyes suddenly sharp with surprise. Most people never asked that. Most people never even cared. A long pause stretched between them. The sounds of the city continued around them. Cars honking, people laughing, the hum of life moving forward without them. The veteran's lips parted slightly as if deciding whether or not to answer. Shaq leaned in slightly, his towering frame making him impossible to ignore. "Where, sir?" he repeated, his tone gentle but firm. The old man swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Iraq," he finally rasped, "and Afghanistan." Shaq's heart pounded. The name, the wars. It couldn't be a coincidence. The old man lowered his gaze, lost in thought. But Shaq wasn't done yet. His instincts told him there was more to this story. Something big. The city's noise seemed to fade into the background as Shaq focused entirely on the frail man before him. There was something about the way the veteran held his dog tag, like a lifeline, a final connection to a world that had long since moved on without him. Shaq sat down on the cold pavement beside him, ignoring the stares from passers-by. "What's your name, sir?" The veteran hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, he looked like he was debating whether to answer at all. Then finally he exhaled, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Frank," he said quietly. "Frank Dawson." Shaq's chest tightened. That name. "Nice to meet you, Frank," Shaq said, his voice softer now. "You said you served in Iraq and Afghanistan?" Frank nodded. His tired eyes seemed to drift somewhere far away, back to a time when he was strong, when he had a purpose. "Yeah, Iraq first, then Afghanistan. Spent most of my life in the military. Didn't know how to do anything else." Shaq noticed how Frank's fingers trembled as he spoke. Not just from the cold, but from something deeper, pain that had never really left him. "What happened when you got back?" Shaq asked. Frank gave a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "What didn't happen?" His voice grew rough, each word carrying years of weight. "Came back to nothing. My wife moved on. Couldn't find work. The bills kept piling up, and before I knew it, I was out here." Shaq's jaw tightened. "No one helped you?" Frank scoffed. "You think people care?" "At first, yeah. A couple of friends sent me job leads, but I wasn't the same. Couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. I was angry all the time, and when people get tired of you being broken, they stop showing up." Shaq stayed quiet, letting the words settle. "Eventually," Frank continued, "they just stop calling. And then one day you realize you're alone." Shaq felt a lump form in his throat. He had always known that many veterans struggled when they returned home. But sitting here, listening to Frank, made it feel more real than any news story ever could. Something about the name still nagged at him. It wasn't just familiar. It meant something. Shaq's eyes drifted back to the dog tag in Frank's hand. The scratches, the faded lettering. He had seen a name like this before. Then it hit him. His breath caught. His mind raced back to a conversation he had years ago at a family gathering. Frank Dawson. Shaq took a slow, deep breath before leaning in. "Frank," he said carefully, "did you ever serve near Fallujah?" Frank's tired eyes snapped up. For the first time, they held something other than resignation. "Yeah," he said, his voice cautious. "I did. How do you know that?" Shaq's stomach flipped. He had heard this name before, from his uncle. Frank Dawson wasn't just another veteran. He had saved Shaq's uncle's life. Shaq's grip tightened around his knee. His mind reeled with the realization. Frank wasn't just a veteran, he was a hero, and he had no idea what he meant to Shaq's family. The weight of realization settled heavily on Shaq's shoulders. He sat there staring at Frank's worn dog tag, his mind racing. The name, the place, the story his uncle had once told him, it all lined up. Frank Dawson had saved lives, and now he was sitting on the street, forgotten. Shaq inhaled sharply, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed quickly, his massive fingers tapping the screen with urgency. Frank frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "What are you doing?" Shaq held up a finger, signaling for patience. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Yo, Shaq, what's up?" It was an old friend of his, Marcus, a retired Marine who now worked in veteran affairs. Shaq kept his voice low but firm. "Hey, I need you to look up a name for me. Frank Dawson, served in Iraq and Afghanistan." There was a pause. "Why? What's going on?" Shaq's eyes never left Frank's. "Just check for me, man. This is important." Marcus sighed. "All right, give me a second." Shaq ended the call and looked back at Frank, who was watching him warily. Listen, don't worry about it, Shaq said, standing up. You eaten today? Frank hesitated, then shook his head. Not since yesterday morning. Shaq didn't say another word. He turned and walked over to a nearby food cart where the smell of fresh grilled chicken filled the air. The vendor, a middle-aged man, looked up in surprise as Shaq approached. Hey, my man, Shaq said, pulling out his wallet. Let me get 2 full meals and make 'em big. The vendor's eyes widened. Shaq? Oh man, this one's on the house. Shaq shook his head. Nah, I pay like everybody else. He handed over a $100 bill. And if anyone else out here is hungry, feed 'em too. The vendor nodded quickly, getting to work. Meanwhile, something was happening around them. The people who had ignored Frank before were now stopping to watch. Whispers spread. Is that Shaq? Why is he sitting with that homeless guy? Wait, is he helping him? A few people pulled out their phones, filming. Back at the bench, Shaq handed Frank a warm meal and a bottle of water. Frank stared at it for a moment before finally accepting it with shaking hands. Thank you, he muttered. Shaq sat beside him again, arms resting on his knees. You don't owe me thanks, man. Just eat. Frank nodded and took his first bite, his eyes briefly closing as he savored real food. Shaq watched him, but his mind was still spinning. His phone buzzed. Shaq's stomach tightened as he saw Marcus's name on the screen. He answered. Talk to me. Marcus exhaled sharply. Shaq, where did you find this guy? Shaq's grip on his phone tightened. He's sitting right next to me. Why? Marcus hesitated. Because, man, Frank Dawson isn't just some veteran. He was a damn war hero. Shaq's breath caught. What? Dude, this guy saved an entire unit overseas. There's a whole report on it. He went missing years ago. His family thought he was dead. He was never supposed to end up on the streets. Shaq's jaw clenched. He turned to Frank, who was quietly eating, completely unaware of the revelation unfolding. Shaq's heart pounded as he processed the news. He put his phone down, exhaled, and turned to Frank. We need to talk. The street buzzed around them, but Shaq barely heard it. His phone was still pressed to his ear as Marcus's words echoed in his mind. Frank Dawson isn't just some veteran. He was a damn war hero. Shaq swallowed hard, his gaze shifting to the frail man beside him, who was still eating his meal, completely unaware of the bombshell that had just dropped. Are you sure? Shaq asked, his voice low. Marcus sighed. I pulled up everything I could. This guy wasn't just in the military. He's got medals, commendations, everything. He saved an entire unit in a battle overseas. They assumed he died in combat, but something must have gone wrong with the records. Shaq clenched his jaw. His family? Marcus hesitated. They were never notified when he was found alive. He must have fallen through the cracks. By the time he reappeared, he was injured, alone. And I guess nobody followed up. Shaq exhaled sharply, running a hand over his head. This wasn't just unfair. It was unbelievable. He ended the call and turned to Frank. We need to talk. Frank glanced up, his brow furrowed. Something wrong? Shaq studied him, taking in the deep lines on his weathered face, the shaking hands, the tired but still sharp eyes. This man had been forgotten, but he wasn't just a veteran. He wasn't just another homeless person trying to survive. He was a legend. Shaq took a deep breath. Frank, were you in Iraq? Frank's hand stilled over his meal. His posture stiffened. Yeah. Afghanistan too? A slow nod. Shaq's heart pounded. Do you remember a mission? Something about a unit trapped behind enemy lines? Frank's eyes flickered with something painful. He set his food down. A long silence stretched between them before Frank finally exhaled. I remember everything. Shaq leaned in. You saved them, didn't you? Frank let out a dry chuckle. I didn't do anything special. Just did what needed to be done. Shaq shook his head. No, Frank. You didn't just do what needed to be done. You pulled off something impossible. You brought an entire unit home. They thought you were dead. Frank's expression darkened. Might as well have been. Shaq felt a tightness in his chest. You got lost in the system, man. Your family never knew you made it out. Frank flinched. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Shaq could see the storm of emotions in his eyes. They thought I was dead. Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. Shaq nodded. Yeah, man. They never got word. Something went wrong with the paperwork. Frank's breath came out shaky. He rubbed a trembling hand over his face. All these years, I thought they gave up on me. Shaq's chest ached. How many nights had Frank sat on these streets, believing no one was looking for him? They didn't give up, Shaq said firmly. They just never knew. Frank's eyes glistened, but he quickly looked away, blinking. Doesn't change much now. Shaq wasn't having it. It changes everything. A small crowd had gathered around them, sensing something important was happening. People whispered, "What's going on? Did Shaq just say this guy's a war hero? That can't be real." Shaq ignored them. This moment wasn't about anyone but Frank. He put a firm hand on Frank's shoulder. "You're not just a veteran. Just a veteran, man. You're a damn legend." Frank gave a weak laugh, shaking his head. "Legends don't sleep on sidewalks." Shaq's grip tightened. "Not anymore." Shaq stood up and turned to the crowd. "This man deserves better, and we're going to fix that. Right now." Frank shifted uncomfortably as the murmurs around him grew louder. More and more people had stopped to watch the scene unfolding between him and Shaq. A few had their phones out, whispering among themselves, trying to piece together what was happening. Some still looked skeptical, but others were starting to recognize something important was unfolding before their eyes. Shaq stood tall, his massive presence impossible to ignore. But he wasn't commanding attention for himself. He was making sure everyone focused on Frank. "Y'all walk past him every day," Shaq's deep voice boomed. "But do you know who this man is? Do you know what he's done?" A few people in the front of the growing crowd exchanged confused glances. A woman, probably in her late 50s, suddenly gasped. She pushed through the people, her hand covering her mouth. Wait a second." Her voice trembled. "Are you Frank Dawson?" Frank flinched at the sound of his name from a stranger's lips. He squinted at the woman, unsure. "Yeah," he said cautiously. Her eyes filled with tears. "My grandfather, James Connor, he served with you. He used to tell stories about a Frank Dawson. He always said you were the bravest man he ever met." Frank's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He seemed almost too overwhelmed to speak. Shaq gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "You hear that, man? People remember." The young men who had mocked Frank earlier were still standing nearby. Their cocky expressions had vanished. One of them, the one who had made the snide, probably faking it comment, shifted uneasily. He avoided Frank's gaze, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't know," he mumbled. Shaq turned toward them. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm. "You never know what someone's been through. You judged him without knowing a thing about him. Look at him now." The young men nodded stiffly, clearly ashamed. A man in a business suit stepped closer, peering at Frank with curiosity. "Is all this true?" he asked. "You were really a war hero?" Frank exhaled, rubbing his face. "I don't know about hero. Just did my job." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Then, a phone screen lit up. Someone had started recording. In just a few seconds, Frank's story was about to be seen by the world. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. More people were filming now, their phone screens glowing in the dim streetlight. Shaq looked around, then suddenly clapped his hands together, the sound echoing through the street. "All right, we're fixing this. Right now." Frank blinked, startled by Shaq's sudden energy. The veteran had spent years being ignored, forgotten. Now all eyes were on him, and it was overwhelming. What do you mean?" Frank asked hesitantly. Shaq grinned. "How would you like a warm bed tonight?" Frank hesitated. He glanced down at his tattered gloves, his worn-out coat. He had spent so many years surviving on the streets that the thought of a real bed felt foreign. I don't want to be a burden," he mumbled. Shaq waved off the concern immediately. "A burden? Man, please. You risked your life for this country, and you think getting you a bed for the night is too much? No way." Frank opened his mouth to protest, but Shaq was already pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, then put the call on speaker. "Yo, I need a favor," Shaq said when the line picked up. A voice on the other end answered immediately. "What's up, big man?" "You still got that hotel downtown?" Shaq asked. "Yeah, why?" Shaq turned to Frank and smiled. "I need a suite. Not a room, a suite. And I need it tonight." The crowd gasped. Even the people who had only stopped out of curiosity were now fully invested in what was happening. The voice on the phone chuckled. You got it, Shaq. I'll have the key waiting at the front desk. Shaq nodded. And put it under his name. Frank Dawson. Frank's lips parted slightly. His name. It had been so long since someone said it with any kind of meaning, any kind of respect. Shaq ended the call and clapped a hand on Frank's shoulder. All right, my guy. You're about to sleep in the best bed you've ever been in. Frank let out a shaky breath. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the sheer shock of how quickly his night had turned around. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Shaq grinned. Then don't say anything yet. We're not done. The words caught Frank off guard. Not done. The crowd was watching closely, hanging on every word. A few had even started clapping. Shaq turned toward the people filming and pointed at one of them. Y'all recording this? The person holding the phone nodded. Shaq's smile widened. Good, because tomorrow we're changing. This man's life for good. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Frank had no idea what was coming next. Frank Dawson stirred awake, his body sinking into the soft mattress beneath him. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. The warmth of the blankets, the silence of the room, it was all too foreign. For years, his mornings had begun with the sharp sting of cold concrete against his back, the noise of the city waking up around him, the ache of hunger gnawing at his stomach. But now, as his eyes fluttered open, he found himself in a place so different that it took him a few moments to understand where he was. A hotel room, a real bed. His tired eyes scanned the space, adjusting to the dim light filtering through the heavy curtains. The plush carpet cushioned his bare feet as he slowly sat up, his body stiff from years of hardship. For the first time in decades, he had slept without fear. No sirens in the background, no shuffling footsteps of other homeless men and women trying to find shelter, no gut-wrenching worry about where his next meal would come from. Then his gaze landed on something unexpected. A suit. Neatly folded on the chair near the window, the crisp navy blue fabric looked brand new. Next to it, an envelope with his name on it. Frank hesitated, his rough, calloused fingers trembling as he picked up the envelope and slowly opened it. A small white card inside read, "Get ready. Big day ahead. Shaq." Frank swallowed hard. What was Shaq planning? For years, people had walked past him as if he were invisible. Now, one of the most famous men in the world was changing his life, and he still couldn't understand why. His eyes shifted back to the suit. It had been years since he had worn anything other than worn-out jackets and frayed shirts. With a deep breath, he lifted the suit, feeling the smooth, expensive fabric beneath his fingers. Was this really happening? With a mixture of hesitation and excitement, Frank made his way to the bathroom. As he splashed warm water on his face, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The man staring back at him looked different, not just because he was clean-shaven or wearing fresh clothes, but because for the first time in years, he looked like a man who belonged, a man who had hope. Slowly, he changed into the suit, buttoning up the crisp white shirt and adjusting the collar. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for him. Then a sharp knock at the door made him jump. Frank froze. He hadn't had visitors in years. Hesitating for a moment, he finally stepped forward and opened the door. Outside stood a camera crew. Bright lights, reporters, microphones. Frank blinked, overwhelmed. The hallway was packed with people. Some he recognized as journalists. Others held cameras with news station logos on them. And then there was a man holding a microphone, looking right at him. "Frank Dawson?" the man asked, a slight excitement in his voice. Frank's throat felt dry. He nodded slowly. The reporter smiled. "Shaquille O'Neal is waiting for you downstairs." And so is the rest of the world. Frank's chest tightened. The rest of the world? He stepped forward hesitantly, the sounds of the murmuring crowd growing louder. Then as he reached the elevator, the doors opened, revealing Shaq himself. The 7 feet 1 inch giant grinned. "You ready, my man?" Frank felt his breath hitch. For the first time in years, he wasn't just someone people ignored. He was someone worth remembering. Outside, a massive crowd was waiting for him. The crowd was electric. Camera flashes flickered like lightning, and murmurs of anticipation rippled through the sea of people gathered outside the hotel. Reporters clutched their microphones, ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. Frank Dawson stood frozen at the entrance, his breath caught in his throat. He had spent years being invisible, ignored by the world. But now, all eyes were on him. And right at the center of it all stood Shaquille O'Neal, towering over the crowd, his signature grin stretched across his face. "Frank," Shaq called, his deep voice cutting through the commotion. "We have a surprise for you." Frank swallowed hard, his legs unsteady beneath him. He had been through wars, survived battles, endured the crushing weight of loneliness, yet nothing had prepared him for this moment. Shaq gestured, and a man in a crisp navy suit stepped forward. The crowd hushed. The man adjusted his tie before speaking into the microphone. "Mr. Dawson, my name is Robert Hayes. I'm a representative from the National Veteran Support Foundation." Frank stiffened. He hadn't heard that name in years. Robert continued, his voice warm but firm. "We've heard your story, and after verifying everything, we've decided that a hero like you should never have to sleep on the streets again." Frank's chest tightened. What was happening? Then came the words that made his knees buckle. "We're giving you a permanent home, fully paid for." The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, even tears from strangers who had just learned his story. Frank's body swayed as if the ground had just been ripped out from under him. A home? A real home? Not an alleyway, not a cold bench, not the damp, miserable back streets he had called shelter for too long. His lips trembled. He wanted to say something, anything, but his voice betrayed him. Instead, his body reacted. His knees buckled, and he collapsed. Gasps filled the air. Shaq lunged forward, catching him before he hit the pavement. "I got you, big man. You're good." Frank clutched Shaq's arm, gripping it like a lifeline. His eyes welled with tears. For years, he had convinced himself that this world had forgotten about him, that his sacrifices, his service, his pain, none of it mattered. Yet here he was, being held up by one of the most famous men on the planet, surrounded by people who suddenly cared. "Why?" Frank croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this for me?" Shaq knelt beside him, his expression serious now. He placed a massive hand on Frank's shoulder and leaned in. "Because, Frank, you saved my uncle's life." The crowd gasped and Frank's eyes widened. "What?" Frank Dawson blinked rapidly, his frail hands gripping Shaq's arm like a man holding onto a rope dangling over a cliff. The weight of the moment pressed on his chest, making it hard to breathe. "What did you just say?" Frank whispered, his voice barely audible over the excited murmurs of the crowd. Shaq, still kneeling beside him, gave a small nod. His face, usually full of humor and warmth, was now serious, almost reverent. "You saved my uncle's life, Frank." The words hung in the cold evening air, their meaning slowly sinking into Frank's mind. He shook his head, disbelief etched into every line on his weathered face. "No, that can't be right. I've never met you before, Shaq." Shaq exhaled and gently patted Frank's shoulder before standing up. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped a few buttons. Then he turned the screen towards Frank. A grainy, old military photo filled the screen. A group of young soldiers in dusty uniforms, their faces tired but proud. Some of them had bandages on their arms and heads, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and relief. And there, right in the center of the image, was a much younger Frank Dawson. Frank gasped, his trembling fingers reaching out as if he could touch the faces of the past. Shaq's voice was thick with emotion. "That's my uncle, James Harrison. He told me the story when I called him last night." Frank's throat tightened. The name was familiar, too familiar. He could see the face of a young, terrified soldier, pinned down by enemy fire, his leg bleeding. And then it hit him. That soldier was James. Frank had carried him on his back for nearly 2 miles under enemy fire, refusing to leave him behind. The memory, long buried beneath years of hardship and pain, came rushing back like a tidal wave. His chest heaved as he sucked in a sharp breath. "Your uncle. I remember him." Shaq crouched back down, looking Frank directly in the eyes. "He remembers you, too, and he never stopped trying to find out what happened to you. But they told him you were missing in action." Frank squeezed his eyes shut. He had been wounded not long after that mission, lost in the system, shuffled through different hospitals. By the time he recovered, the world had moved on, and so had the military. No one had come looking for him, until now. Someone in the crowd sniffled. Then a lone clap rang out. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire crowd exploded into applause. Frank flinched, overwhelmed by the sudden wave of cheers. People clapped, some even wiping their eyes. Others pulled out their phones, capturing this incredible moment. Shaq helped Frank to his feet, steadying him as his knees nearly gave out. Tears streamed down the old veteran's face. "I don't understand," Frank muttered. "Why? Why would you do all this for me?" Shaq smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "Because you did it for my uncle. You didn't know who he was back then. You didn't do it for recognition. You did it because it was the right thing to do." Frank shook his head in disbelief. "And now, you're doing the same for me?" Shaq nodded. "That's how it works, big man. You took care of my family. Now I'm taking care of you." The crowd cheered louder. Even the young men who had mocked Frank earlier now stood frozen, their faces pale with shame. A man in a sharp military uniform stepped forward from the crowd, his chest decorated with medals. He held something small in his gloved hands. "Mr. Dawson," the officer said formally, "on behalf of the U.S. military, we are here to correct a terrible mistake. You were left behind. You were forgotten. But tonight, that changes." Frank watched in shock as the officer pinned a Medal of Honor onto his worn-out coat, the highest military award. Gasps rippled through the audience. People saluted. Frank clutched the medal, his body shaking. His lips quivered, his voice breaking. I don't deserve this." Shaq grinned, shaking his head. "You deserved it decades ago, Frank. We're just making things right." Frank, a man who had endured years of pain, of loneliness, of being forgotten, finally let himself smile. As the cameras flashed, Shaq leaned down and whispered something to Frank. And this isn't even the best part. The night air was still filled with energy as Frank sat quietly on the hotel bed Shaq had arranged for him. His old hands rested on his lap, still trembling, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming emotions of the last 24 hours. He had spent years being invisible, ignored, forgotten, and now within hours the whole world knew his name. His phone, a simple prepaid device Shaq had given him earlier, buzzed constantly. At first he ignored it, but when he finally picked it up, his eyes widened in disbelief. Messages flooded in. "You're a hero, Frank. We failed you, but we won't let it happen again. You saved a life back then. Now it's our turn to give back to you. The world needs more people like you." Mr. Dawson Frank's chest tightened. For so long he had believed he was forgotten. But now, strangers were sending love, appreciation, and support from every corner of the country. Earlier that night, someone in the crowd had recorded the entire moment. Shaq kneeling beside Frank, revealing their connection, the emotional reunion, the Medal of Honor being pinned to his coat. That video hit the internet like wildfire. Within an hour, it had thousands of views. By morning, it had reached millions. Celebrities, veterans, and everyday people began sharing it, commenting, reacting. A famous actor tweeted, "How did we let this happen? Frank Dawson, you're an inspiration." A retired general posted, "This man should never have been on the streets. The system failed him. Thank you at Shaq for reminding us to do better." A sports analyst wrote, "Shaq is a legend, not just on the court, but in life. This is how you use fame for good." The young men who had mocked Frank earlier, they posted an emotional public apology. One of them, a boy no older than 19, wrote, "Last night I judged a man I didn't know. I laughed at him. I was wrong. Mr. Dawson, I'm sorry. I promise I'll never turn a blind eye again." Frank wiped at his eyes, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every veteran who had been cast aside. Then came the biggest shock. A GoFundMe campaign had been set up overnight by a complete stranger, someone who had simply seen the video and felt moved to help. Frank's hands shook as he clicked on the link. His jaw dropped. Over $350,000 had been donated. The title of the fundraiser? "Let's Give a Hero the Life He Deserves." The messages on the page were just as powerful. No veteran should ever be homeless. "We're with you, Frank. Stay strong. You sacrificed for us. Now it's our turn." Frank's vision blurred with tears. He had gone to sleep the night before, unsure of where he would wake up the next morning. Now he had more support than he had ever dreamed of. As he sat there still processing it all, Shaq knocked on the door and stepped in. Frank, you're not going to believe this, Shaq said, holding up his own phone. Frank blinked up at him. What now? Shaq grinned and turned the screen toward him. Frank's heart nearly stopped. It was an official email from the White House. Mr. Dawson, the President of the United States would like to personally invite you to Washington, D.C. to honor your service and sacrifices. Frank stared at the words, his breath hitching in his throat. This had to be a dream. His voice cracked. Shaq, I don't belong in a place like that. Shaq crouched down in front of him, placing a massive hand on his shoulder. Frank, you've belonged there all along. They just took too long to realize it. Frank clutched the phone, his entire body shaking. As Frank struggled to find words, Shaq grinned and said, and that's not even the biggest surprise. Frank Dawson sat at his kitchen table, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in front of him. His old hands, once shaking from cold and hunger, now felt steady, stronger than they had in years. The aroma of fresh brewed coffee filled the air, blending with the quiet hum of a life he thought he'd never have again. The sunlight streamed through the window of his new home. His home. Just weeks ago, he had been sleeping on the hard pavement, shivering in the cold, ignored by the world. Now he had a roof over his head, a bed to sleep in, and a community that cared about him. And all of it started with one act of kindness. Frank lifted his cup to take a sip, letting the warmth spread through him. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Frank wasn't the type to take without giving back. The moment he had settled into his new life, he made a promise to himself. He wasn't going to waste this second chance. Now every week, he visited a local veterans shelter, sitting with men and women who had been through what he had. He shared his story, not the pain of it, but the lesson in it. There's always hope, he told them. You just need one person to believe in you. Some listened, some didn't, but he kept showing up because he knew what it was like to feel forgotten. The restaurant where Shaq first found him, it had become more than just a business. It had transformed into a place of compassion. The owner, inspired by Frank's story, announced a new policy: free meals for homeless veterans. Every single day, anyone who had served and was struggling could come in, sit down, and enjoy a hot meal. No questions asked. The same people who had once walked past Frank without a second glance now stopped to shake his hand. Some apologized for ignoring him. Others simply thanked him for his service. And then there were the young men, the ones who had mocked him on that first night. Frank hadn't seen them since Shaq had called them out in front of the crowd. He figured they had just moved on, forgotten the moment. But one afternoon, while volunteering at the veterans shelter, he looked up and saw them. They weren't just standing there. They were helping serve meals. One of them, the same kid who had kicked over his sign, walked over to Frank, rubbing the back of his neck. His face was red, not with anger, but with shame. I was an idiot, the young man admitted. We all were. Frank looked at him for a long moment before nodding. You learned. That's what matters. And with that, he shook the kid's hand. One evening, as Frank was closing up at the shelter, a familiar deep voice echoed through the hallway. Still out here changing lives, I see. Frank turned, his face breaking into a wide grin. Shaq stood in the doorway, his massive frame nearly blocking the entrance. Frank laughed. Takes one to know one. Shaq stepped forward and pulled Frank into a bear hug. It had only been a few weeks since their story went viral, but so much had changed. You didn't just get your life back, Shaq said, looking around. You're giving other people theirs. Frank shrugged. You started it, Shaq smirked. Nah, man. You were always that guy. The world just needed a reminder. Shaq handed Frank an envelope. Frank raised an eyebrow. What's this? Shaq grinned. Open it. Frank carefully tore it open and pulled out a first-class plane ticket to Washington, D.C. Frank's hands shook slightly as he read the letter inside. Mr. Dawson, the President of the United States would like to personally honor your service and dedication to this country at a special ceremony in your name. Frank's breath caught. You've got to be kidding me, Shaq chuckled. You think I'd let you stay off the radar? You deserve this, Frank. Frank swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. I don't even know what to say. Shaq patted him on the back. Then don't say anything. Just show up. A few days later, as Frank packed his bag for his trip to the White House, he took one last look around his home, a home he thought he'd never have again. He thought about how one night, one moment, had rewritten his entire story. One act of kindness had started a ripple effect. The restaurant now fed the homeless. The young men who mocked him had become volunteers. Veterans who felt forgotten now had hope. Frank Dawson had once believed he didn't matter, but now he knew the truth. One life can change the world, and one act of kindness, it can change everything.